So before one can even venture into this what rightly considered to be the heart of the matter, of the ultimate question. It's also worthy of reminding ourselves that even the exposition, scriptural, scholarly or otherwise, on the nature of ultimate reality in the culture which does not have a properly shared consensus on what consciousness is in itself an interesting phenomena. Therefore, earlier I've asked as a proposition for whom that question of recognition. Who is here to recognize that ultimate reality? We all, most of us, know that the culture itself is a phenomenology of a shared consensus. That's what is called culture. And the culture that we live in is a very different from the one that we speak about now in terms of its direct examples, where such philosophies can be born and thrive. Because the consensus of the culture in the Occident that we all share currently is with an emphasis on egoic consciousness. It is something which is the root cause of very, very notion of our identity. Therefore, even spiritual practice is always, whether we know it or not, I emphasize, knowingly or otherwise, is approached from that perspective. Whereas the culture of the Orient, whose greatest expositions then imported into this soil, are completely found on different premises. All these scriptures, all this, whether we speak about the Advaita Vedanta that becomes then so popularized and widespread, is born in the culture where one at a given already knows that one's whole business here is to realize the nature of the non-self, which means to realize the nature of one's ultimate reality. The quest has a different, if you will, beginning in the first place. The quest of the one who is approaching this comes from the perspective of the egoic identity and approaches all spiritual practices from that. And whenever that identity is challenged or questioned, one would be faced with a threshold. And this is a cultural predicament. It's not your predicament or my predicament. It's a cultural predicament. Therefore, the notion of self-realization here is no longer a notion of whether I am going to realize myself or not. It's the matter of what our culture is and where our culture is heading. So in other words, even the premises of how we interpret these teachings are different. We're trying to adapt these teachings to fit our culture. And that's what happened to all, absolutely all, without exception, spiritual traditions that uninterruptedly perhaps existed for some time and were imported because this also was in requirement of the necessity of time. And some spiritual teachers, some great luminaries of our time, took different approaches, deliberately or not. It is left to wonder. But it is interesting that Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, for instance, was above all else trying to appeal to a scientific mind of a modern man, to a scientific mind, so as to validate these teachings, so as to dislodge these teachings from otherwise the domain of pure lore. The process started earlier. We have spoken about it already before that. Any of you who remember us speaking about it, or if you have read it about the first son of India, Adi, not Adi Shankar, beg your pardon, Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. It was Sri Aurobindo who did his best to present the Vedic knowledge not as some kind of collection of wild myths, no matter how wonderful, but could be easily ignored or dismissed on the account of its being just nothing more than recollection of some imagination of this or that nation. But what he wanted to redress, so that the Indologists who chiefly came to this culture from that already firmly established in egoic consciousness, which dismissed consciousness as the basis. Let us not confuse believing in God in any its form as anything other than egoic consciousness. It's just a different degree. Saints, of course, and mystics of every given tradition come and break that neatly presented picture. When they are more kind of like use to us, we rehabilitate them and canonize them. When they were not so much in use, they were either dismissed, hospitalized, sedated, or annihilated, so that they don't disturb the otherwise cozy setup. Therefore, that drift, that separation, where the scientism becomes the religion of our day, and all the other religions pursue their own goals and ends, in the name of God, of course, because it's always in the name of God. Every holy war always rages in the name of God. Whether this war is real with automatic guns, machines, machetes, or other weapon, or it's just purely ideological war, it's still a war. It's not peace. But not to scatter your mind too much, I just want to bring that back to that, your attention back to that fact that it is the study of all these timeless teachings. The studies were in the hands of scholars. In Egypt, they were called Egyptologists. In India, those who were studying this in Oxford, Cambridge, or Sorbonne, or whatever other university. They were Indologists, and the perspectives that they come up with were such that they were deeply offensive to the sages of the culture who understood and directly cognized the value of these teachings. So going back to the efforts of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was to bring that process of rehabilitation. Obviously, there was nothing to rehabilitate, but it is a rehabilitation of that sacred knowledge, sacred wisdom, so it can gain value again in our day and time. So it can be validated by the age of science.